2 sentences in Genesis, 1 tiny line, and an entire constellation of questions. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. That is all Genesis gives us. No parade, no long biography, no dramatic trial or public miracle. Just a simple claim that a man moved through life in a particular relation to the divine, and then disappeared from the human register in a way the ancient narrator felt compelled to mark. Enoch, the man who walked with God. Say the words slowly. Let them hang. Imagine a single stride after which history notices nothing more but the fact of the stride itself. In a world that prefers lists, deeds, and headlines, Genesis offers a quiet, almost domestic testimony. Here is a life summed up by a walk. We owe our first task to the brevity of the text. Before we chase later imaginations that turned Enoch into seer, scribe, and heavenly traveler, we must listen to the original whisper. The line in Genesis 5 appears inside a long genealogy. Adam begot Seth, Seth begot Enoch, and so on. For most names the pattern is familiar. A father begets a son, the father's age at the birth is given, and then the father lives a long life and dies. The genealogy proceeds like a litany of lives measured and closed. Then, when it reaches a certain name, Enoch, something different interrupts the rhythm. Where the formula normally reads that he died, here the narrator writes instead, he walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him. The Hebrew is compact and somewhat ambivalent. The phrase he walked with God uses a verb that implies intimacy and coherence, hiking beside, living in step. The following clause, often rendered as and he was not, for God took him, raises immediate questions. Took him where? Taken in what manner? Was this death? Was it a translation to a divine realm? The grammar is spare, the narrative offers no elaboration. We should note 2 things very plainly. First, Genesis itself gives no cosmic travel diary. It does not describe visions of heaven, negotiations with angels, prophetic sermons, or a public contest with rulers. It gives a moral portrait fragment, a verdict almost, of a man defined by his relational posture toward God. Second, later readers have read into that fragment a wide range of meanings. We will be careful throughout to separate what the early Genesis text says from what later communities made of it. Before we move on to those later imaginings, it is worth lingering a while with the elements Genesis provides, because the smallest details became seeds for enormous growth. 2 such details matter especially: Enoch's placement in the genealogy as the 7th from Adam, and the curious number attached to him, 365 years. 7 is a number that hums with significance throughout the Bible. It marks creation's completeness, 7 days, ritual cycles, and a sense of wholeness. To be the 7th in a lineage that begins with Adam casts Enoch in the light of a certain symbolic completion. He stands at a threshold. His life sits at the 7th step from the beginning, an image that invites readers to think in patterns and symbolic cycles rather than mere chronology. That placement is why, even before later writers expanded his story, Enoch carried an aura of representative significance. He is not just an obscure ancestor, he is a figure at a node where genealogy, cosmic order, and existential questions overlap. Then there is the age, 365 years. For most of the other antediluvian patriarchs, the numbers are grand, 900, 800, over 900. But Enoch's lifespan is relatively small and precise. The number 365 resonates unmistakably with the solar year. Scholars and ancient readers noticed the parallel quickly, a life that counts the cycles of the sun. Whether the text intends Enoch to embody a solar rhythm, or whether later interpreters projected that meaning back onto the number, the correlation invites theological reflection. Enoch's life is measured to a complete circuit of the heavens. It is as if his days map a cosmic calendar. We should not rush to mystical conclusions. The Genesis narrator gives us data. What we do with that data requires careful restraint. Saying that 365 aligns with the solar year is a reasonable observation. Saying that Enoch was literally a personified calendar is interpretive. But the very presence of a precise, resonant number made Enoch an attractive subject for communities pondering cosmology and time. There is also linguistic nuance worth noting. The verb walked in the Hebrew text, halak, carries ordinary and spiritual senses. People walk with each other. They walk with companions and neighbors. They walk through seasons and landscapes. To say someone walked with God is to commend their life rhythm to the notion of companionship with the divine. It suggests a daily habit rather than a single dramatic episode. This is why many readers, ancient and modern, have taken Enoch's example to be fundamentally ethical and existential, a life ordered by an intimate, ongoing relationship with God. But what does God took him mean? Some early interpreters understood it as a form of divine translation, a removal from the mortal condition without experiencing death in the usual sense. Others heard it as a pious way to say Enoch's death was so unremarkable or so unusual that it could be phrased only as God taking him. The Hebrew here resists definitive conclusion. That ambiguity is part of its power. It invites interpretation without forcing it. So far we have kept within the biblical kernel, placement in genealogy, the distinctive wording, the age, and the suggestive symbolism. These are the ingredients the earliest readers had. From there, the story of Enoch took very different shapes as it moved into new social and religious contexts. We live in a world where texts grow in conversation with their readers. Some of the most startling expansions of Enoch's name come from the centuries often called the Second Temple period, roughly the half-millennium before and after the turn of the Common Era, when Jewish communities were wrestling with empire, sectarian identity, and questions about divine justice. The terse Genesis notice functioned like a spark dropped on tinder. A tiny textual ember flared into a literature that would tell of angels who fell, heavenly books that record human deeds, a Son of Man figure who presides over final judgment, and a transformed image of Enoch as an intermediary, scribe, prophet, even traveler through the cosmos. But before we step from the biblical kernel into the later Enochic universe, pause to consider why that small line could carry such potency. The ancient world was not uninterested in awe and spectacle, far from it. Yet communities under stress often hunger for explanations that restore meaning to suffering. Why does evil seem to go unchecked? Why do the righteous suffer? How will cosmic order be vindicated? A man in Genesis who simply walks with God and vanishes becomes in such contexts a promise. There are beings who share the divine proximity. There are destinies not exhausted by earthly timelines. The cosmos may contain records and agents who account for injustice. We must also acknowledge that human imagination does not spread evenly. The same seed produces different blooms in different soils. Among some groups, particularly those that preserved and expanded Enoch's story, the figure became a repository for eschatological hopes, a revealer of secret knowledge about the heavens, a scribe who bears witness to the moral ledger, a mediator between the visible world and the divine courts. Among others, Enoch remained a quiet moral exemplar, a model of faithful walking rather than a cosmic celebrity. This distinction, the quiet kernel versus the florid expansions, will be the thread we follow throughout. For now, returning once more to Genesis, it is helpful to place Enoch beside other patriarchs in order to magnify what is unique about his portrayal. Consider Noah. Noah is a figure of public action. He builds an ark, he survives divine judgment, he re-enters a ravaged world and plants a vineyard. Noah's life is a narrative of large visible acts that alter history. Abraham is the paradigm of covenantal pilgrimage and covenantal promise. His life is marked by migration, testing, and covenant-making words. Moses stands as mediator and lawgiver, leading a people through exile and back into a promised order. Even Elijah and Elisha emerge as dramatic prophetic exchangers of power. Enoch, by contrast, lacks a public itinerary in Genesis. He offers a way of life rather than a sequence of public victories. That contrast is important because it shapes early readers' imaginations. If you live under imperial oversight and feel stripped of public agency, There is consolation in a figure whose primary claim is faithful walking. If you are anxious that justice will not be done, there is comfort in a figure whose end is mysterious, suggesting that God has dealings we do not yet measure. If the calendar matters to your ritual life, Enoch's 365 invites you to reorder time. In short, this quiet phrase in Genesis provided multiple addresses for different sorts of need. We should also consider the narrative technique of Genesis itself. Genealogies, in ancient Near Eastern literature, do more than report births and deaths. They organize memory, assert identity, and establish theological claims in compressed form. The Genesis genealogies are not raw annals. They are theological devices that connect primeval history to the present of the narrator and listener. Within those devices, anomalies function as intentional markers. The anomalous phrasing about Enoch is therefore not a mere trivia, but an intentional signpost. It signals to anyone reading or hearing the list that Enoch's case requires attention. Beyond the textual form, the cultural rhythms of the ancient world matter. Names were not inert tags. They bore meaning and sometimes became loci for storytelling. The ancients also kept calendars as communal instruments, structures that regulated worship, agriculture, and memory. A life counted to 365 years resonates with such communal rhythms. It suggests that Enoch is not only an individual, but a hinge connecting human life to cosmic measure. So, as we prepare to follow later narratives, two disciplinary cautions are necessary. First, the Genesis line is the foundational datum. We cannot let later wonderments overwrite it in our analysis without explicit indication. If a later text calls Enoch a heavenly scribe, we must say, that is a later imaginative expansion. Second, the presence of imaginative expansions does not prove the original author intended them or believed in them. Communities read texts in light of their concerns and create interpretive worlds around scant data. That process is neither illegitimate nor uniform. It is creative and contingent. Let us now look, briefly and carefully, at the kinds of things readers built around the Genesis notice. I will only sketch the horizon here, enough to prepare the ground, and save the more detailed mapping for the next segment. One major strand is what scholars call the Book of the Watchers. It is an early section of the larger Enochic corpus, and it dramatizes a problem of theodicy, a category of literature seeking to explain the origin of evil amid a creation that bears God's stamp. The Watchers are a group of heavenly beings who descend, take wives among human women, and engender a race of giants. Their transgression becomes a narrative solution to the puzzle of rampant wickedness before the flood. The Watchers also transmit certain forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, and astrological secrets, and in some versions their instruction brings both technological advancement and moral corruption. In these stories, Enoch is not simply a quiet walker, but a mediator. He intercedes, he ascends to heaven, and he records or delivers revelations about heavenly order and the punishment that will come. Another major strand highlights Enoch as a scribe of heaven. The image of books, celestial registers that record human deeds, appears repeatedly. These books serve as metaphors for divine memory and justice. If there is a ledger in which every transgression is entered, then the moral universe is not blind. Enoch appears in some accounts as one who reads or understands these records, as one who can interpret cosmic calendars. We also encounter the motif of the Son of Man in Enochic literature long before its use in some New Testament passages. Here, a figure who is given authority to judge and to inherit eternal kingship appears in visions that a heavenly traveling Enoch narrates. The Son of Man figure is complex and layered, sometimes an eschatological judge, sometimes an ideal righteous human receiving everlasting dominion. The Enochic Son of Man will later reverberate in Christian uses of the term, though the connections are historically contingent and theologies diverse. Finally, a significant piece of the later story is the cosmological and calendrical interest, detailed astronomical and calendrical treatises that claim insight into the workings of the heavens. These parts of the Enochic corpus show a preoccupation with ordering time, which ties back to the Genesis 365 motif in a compelling way. If Enoch's years match the solar cycle, then Enoch becomes a paradigmatic keeper of cosmic rhythm, a model for liturgical and calendrical reformers who want human ritual to track divine order. Two important terminological clarifications will help at this point. The label Enochic literature, or One Enoch, groups several heterogeneous compositions that cohere only loosely around the figure of Enoch and certain thematic interests. Scholars often divide the material into constituent parts: Book of the Watchers, parables or similitudes, astronomical book, dream visions, and an epistle-like section, among others. The works are pseudepigraphal, a technical term meaning they are attributed to a famous figure of the past, in this case Enoch, by later authors. Pseudepigraphy was a common literary practice in antiquity. It is not automatically fraudulent in modern moral judgment, but it is a signal that the texts were composed by later hands projecting words backwards onto an ancestral figure. Another term we will encounter is Second Temple period, which refers broadly to Jewish literature and history situated between the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra's time and the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 CE. It is a period of vibrant literary creativity and sectarian diversity. I mention these parts and terms now to prevent later slippage between the Genesis core and the imaginative universe that grew around it. The Book of Enoch and its relatives are not part of the Pentateuchal genealogy. They are later interpretive creations that drew upon the Genesis notice to address the pressing theological and social questions of their day. A final, preliminary observation before we cross into those later texts. The reception of Enoch did not happen in a single stream. Different communities preserved different images. Some early Jewish groups quoted or alluded to Enochic motifs. Some parts of the New Testament echo language reminiscent of Enochic imagery. Early Christian writers in the East preserved Enochic texts in the liturgical life of the Ethiopian church. Qumran scribes included fragments of Enoch in their caves. In other words, Enoch's afterlife is a plural tapestry. To say that weren't Enoch was canonical for everyone would be false. To say it had no influence would be equally false. The balanced position recognizes both its non-uniform canonical status and its considerable role in shaping religious imagination. Before we proceed, it will be helpful to return for a moment to the moral and devotional question opened by the Genesis line. What does it mean to walk with God in a life shaped by ordinary days? This is not a rhetorical diversion. It is the theological heart of the matter. Because the later expansions, even the ones that imagine Enoch as a celestial scribe, always circle back to the notion that his life was defined by sustained proximity to God. To walk with God can be unpacked in three overlapping registers. First, there is ethical steadfastness. Walking implies continuity. It implies a moral rhythm, choices made again and again, fidelity in small matters as well as large. A community under pressure often remembers saints who did not win in spectacle, but maintained integrity in mundane ways. Enoch's walking becomes a reminder that public heroism is not the only measure of faith. Second, there is relational intimacy. Walking together presupposes companionship. To walk with God is to live in a form of relational trust. It means learning to orient one's daily life toward God's presence, bearing sorrow and joy in a shared trajectory. This relational emphasis counters privatized religion, reduced to formulaic piety. It suggests a lived partnership. Third, there is eschatological orientation. To walk with God is to be on the road toward a destiny that surpasses present mortality. In Genesis, the phrase "God took him" keeps this eschatological possibility open. Whether the phrase means translation, early death, or something else, it points listeners toward a horizon. The life that walks with God participates in some mode in the divine order that will vindicate justice and erase final perplexities. These three registers, ethics, relationship, eschatology, help explain why both simple and elaborate readers found Enoch compelling. For some, he is a moral model. For others, a prototype of transfiguration and revelation. Both impulses are legitimate responses to the Genesis kernel, but they lead to different theological emphases. Now to the first required pause. If this reflection is speaking to you, if you value calm, source-aware retellings, subscribe and like. It helps this channel keep telling stories. Thank you for the small act. The conversation continues. After that short invitation, let us turn toward that immense landscape of later Enochic production. The modest phrase from Genesis, so unassuming, so brief, did not remain content to be a rhetorical oddity. It became, for many communities, an axis on which to pivot their hopes and answers. The next chapter of our exploration will travel into the Second Temple period, sketch the contours of the Book of the Watchers, and examine how images like the Watchers, the books of heaven, and the Son of Man were woven into narratives that tried to make sense of evil, time, and divine justice. But before we enter those texts in detail, a final cautionary note. Later traditions, whether they portray Enoch as a heavenly scribe or as a bearer of secret wisdom, are interpretive responses to historical and existential pressures. They are not uniform endorsements nor homogeneous expansions. We will treat them as the creative theological conversations they are, important, influential, but distinct from the Genesis core. And so we stand now at the threshold. The small sentence in Genesis has done its work. It has summoned us to ask why a life measured as walking with God could capture so much attention. Ahead are visions of angels and giants, of books that record human deeds, of calendars that reconcile ritual time with cosmic motion, and of a Son of Man figure who complicates later messianic imagination. We will approach each of these with attention to historical context and with care for where ancient communities were coming from and what they were trying to say. To begin that journey responsibly, we must step into the Second Temple world with two tools: an eye for what the earliest biblical text actually says, and a sensitivity to the ways communities read silence as invitation. The next part of our exploration will do precisely that, tracing the ways in which the tiny Genesis whisper blossomed into whole libraries of imagination, and why those libraries mattered so much to people who needed an account of injustice and a hope for vindication. The Book of the Watchers begins not with a biography but with an explanation, a cultural and theological attempt to answer a question that gnawed at many ancient hearts. Where does evil come from when the world is meant to be ordered? In that narrative, the terse Genesis notice becomes a hinge. The simple man who walked with God is recast as one who crosses thresholds between heaven and earth, who sees and records what the human eye cannot easily measure. The story imagines a cluster of heavenly beings, called Watchers, who descend to earth, take human wives, and beget a hybrid race of giants. Their fall is a literary solution to the problem of rampant wickedness. Transgressive angels, illicit knowledge, and monstrous offspring explain why humanity spiraled toward catastrophe. Notice how the later authors use Enoch. He becomes the interlocutor between two realms, where Genesis offers a moral epitaph, a life defined by a certain stance. These narratives make him an intercessor and a revealer. He pleads on behalf of creation, ascends to the divine court, and reports what he sees. The image of a scribe grows naturally out of that role. If there are registers in which deeds are written and remembered, someone must read and interpret them. Enoch is that reader. The motif of celestial books, divine ledgers that record human acts, answers an existential dread that injustice will go unaccounted. In an imagined archive where every crime is entered and every tear registered, justice is not lost. It is in divine memory, awaiting enactment. That motif of books ties directly to another preoccupation of the Enochic tradition: time. The Genesis note that Enoch lived 365 years becomes in these texts the kernel of an obsession with calendars and celestial motion. Parts of the Enochic corpus devote extended space to the solar cycle, the courses of the heavenly luminaries, and the correct reckoning of months and festivals. Such material is, on the surface, technical. On the level of communal life, it is normative. Calendars order worship, harvest, and civic rhythm. If human life is to be faithful to divine order, then human time must be arranged to match cosmic time. For readers anxious about cultic integrity, about whether their festivals, sacrifices, and fasts corresponded to the real movement of the heavens. Enoch's 365 is an invitation to restore ritual to cosmic harmony. It matters that this literature was not authored in a single workshop at a single moment. Scholars today speak of the Enochic corpus, or one Enoch, as a composite of varied pieces compiled over centuries. The Book of the Watchers is one early layer. Other strata include the parables, or similitudes, which elaborate on the figure of an exalted Son of Man, the astronomical book which maps the movements of luminaries and the rules of the year, the dream visions which recast Israel's history in symbolic pages, and an epistle-like conclusion that offers ethical exhortation. Each part has its own shape and interests, yet they cohere around certain themes: cosmic order, divine justice, and the figure of a righteous mediator. Because these works are pseudepigraphal, that is, they bear the name of an ancient hero, though composed later, they speak to a common ancient literary practice. Claiming an ancestral voice lent authority to new reflections. It was a way for communities to situate their theological innovations within the weight of tradition. That does not mean the later authors were deceptive in the modern sense. Rather, they used the genre to address contemporary anxieties in the voice of venerated ancestors. We must keep that literary horizon in mind when assessing their theological claims. The imaginative richness of Enochic texts shows how communities read silence as invitation, and how they fashion theological resources for coping with suffering and injustice. We can see then why the story of fallen angels and giant offspring would catch on in a world that had seen empires rise and fall, where local institutions felt fragile, and where theodicy, why the good suffer and the wicked thrive, was not an abstract question but a daily pang. Envision a community in which foreign rulers confiscate lands, where corrupt elites prosper while the poor are crushed, where cultic calendars may have been disrupted by conquest. The Enochic narratives answer with a cosmic courtroom. The Watchers have sinned and will be judged. The Son of Man will execute justice. Such stories comforted by promising that history is not a random sequence of defeats, but a moral order overseen finally by God. This moral ordering helps explain how certain images in Enoch resonated later with Jewish and Christian texts. Take the Son of Man figure. In some of the parables, the Son of Man is an eschatological judge, an investiture figure who receives authority to set the world right. Centuries later, the New Testament uses the language of Son of Man in complex ways. Jesus frequently calls himself by that title in the Gospels, and scholars have long debated how much he or the Gospel writers were drawing on Enochic traditions, apocalyptic imaginations, or older prophetic idioms. It is plausible that the vocabulary and imagery of Enoch contributed to the broader cultural repertoire within which early Christians operated. Yet to move from plausible cultural influence to doctrinal dependence is too quick. The New Testament authors quote and allude selectively. They shape older imagery for their own theological ends. That is why we keep insisting on distinctions. Genesis offers the kernel. Enochic literature elaborates. The New Testament sometimes echoes those elaborations without thereby canonizing the entire later corpus. We find explicit echoes of Enochic thought in two short but telling New Testament moments. Hebrews, the epistle that recalls heroes of faith, mentions Enoch in a sentence that commends his faith-driven removal from mortal experience. The point there is theological. Faith is the horizon in which God acts, sometimes in ways that subvert ordinary expectations about life and death. In Jude, a brief but striking citation credits Enoch with prophecy about the Lord's coming with his holy ones to execute judgment. That citation is provocative because it points directly to a tradition associated with the parables of Enoch. Yet Jude's appeal to that tradition must be weighed carefully. A single citation does not collapse the complex reception history of Enochic writings into canonical endorsement. Jude uses recognized prophetic language to make a polemical point about false teachers. His authority strategy differs from the systematic adoption of an entire corpus into Scripture. At roughly the same time these texts circulated, another set of preservational choices was being made by different communities. Some groups found Enochic materials authoritative and integrated parts into their liturgical and theological lives. The Ethiopian Church, for example, preserved a full rendering of the Enochic corpus in the Ge'ez language. In their canon, what scholars call 1 Enoch survives in something like a canonical status that guided theological and liturgical imagination. Elsewhere, other communities treated the texts as edifying but non-canonical. At Qumran, where we have a snapshot of sectarian reading habits from the Dead Sea caves, fragments of Enochic writings were found among the scrolls. Aramaic copies of portions of Uer's Enoch. Those fragments indicate that some Jewish groups in the late Second Temple environment found Enochic materials meaningful enough to copy and preserve alongside other scriptures and parables. The picture, then, is plural and textured. In some Christian traditions, Enochic literature sank into obscurity and was not taken as scriptural. In others, it was retained and used in liturgy and theology. Modern rediscovery of Ethiopic manuscripts, texts transmitted in the Ethiopian Church and brought to European scholarly attention in the 18th and 19th centuries, opened the intellectual world to this layered tradition. Later, when Aramaic fragments of Enoch turned up among the Dead Sea materials in the 20th century, scholars realized that parts of the Enochic material likely predated the Christian era and had been composed in the milieu of Second Temple Judaism. That discovery complicated older assumptions that Enochic visions were mere Christian interpolations. Instead, it reinforced the sense that Enochic thought was an important, if regionally varied, resource in late ancient Jewish thought. How then should we weigh authority and use? A measured approach recognizes three things at once. First, Enochic writings are historically important. They illuminate how some Jewish groups conceived of cosmic order, divine justice, and prophetic mediator figures. Second, they are not uniformly scriptural across traditions. Their canonical status varies historically and geographically. Third, their theological creativity is valuable even if one does not accept them as scripture. They reveal how communities shaped imagination to cope with suffering, injustice, and the sense of cosmic disorder. Let us linger for a moment on the function of literary images in these texts, because their persuasive power depends on how they confer meaning to actual lives. The Watchers and the Giants are not simply sensationalist fixtures. They are symbolic ways of describing the consequences of boundary violations. What happens when heavenly roles are confused with earthly desires? When knowledge intended for the order of creation becomes a tool of domination? The books of heaven, what scholars call celestial ledgers, are not primitive bureaucratic fantasies. They are theological claims about memory and accountability. If every deed is written, then ultimate reckoning is plausible. If the calendar is aligned with the true movement of the heavens, then worship participates in cosmic order. These images map moral and liturgical solutions onto the problem of disorder. It follows that Enoch's later role as scribe and heavenly ambassador is not just a narrative flourish. It models a social function for those reading the texts. In communities that felt silenced or powerless, priests, scribes, and visionary figures could hold fast to the conviction that memory and record-keeping mattered. To write, a ledger, a genealogy, a tradition, is itself an act of resistance against erasure. That practical social dimension explains why certain groups kept Enochic materials safe. They were not merely speculative cosmologies, but instruments for sustaining community identity and hope. We should also reflect on Enoch's juxtaposition with other biblical exemplars. Earlier, we contrasted him with Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Elijah to highlight different genres of faith. That contrast becomes richer when understood in historical perspective. Heroes like Noah and Moses enact salvation in public, political, or covenantal terms. Enoch models an interior and communal fidelity that, in his later treatments, also becomes revelatory. Elijah's ascent in a whirlwind and chariot is narrated with public drama in 2 Kings. Enoch's disappearance in Genesis is intentionally enigmatic, leaving it to later readers to expand the possibilities. Both figures, Elijah and Enoch, became markers of divine intervention beyond ordinary death, yet the texts and traditions treat them differently. Tradition sometimes conflates their fates in popular imagination, but careful reading distinguishes the genres and purposes of each narrative. It remains crucial to hold interpretive modesty when we encounter texts that make extraordinary claims. The statement, "God took him," can be read in multiple ways: literal translation to the divine realm, a shorthand for a mysterious death, or a theological way of expressing a life wholly oriented toward God. The Second Temple expansions are imaginative and theologically earnest, but they are not historical reportage in the modern sense. Where modern readers are tempted by sensationalist accounts of extraterrestrial watchers or literal, video-like journeys through the cosmos, we should stress interpretive caution. Such readings often impose contemporary categories onto texts whose concerns are primarily moral, liturgical, and communal. That is not to deny the vividness of visionary language, but to insist that the proper scholarly posture combines amazement with restraint. How does all this bear on us now? What does it mean to name Enoch, the man who walked with God, as a life example for our own frail age? The answer comes in two directions: conviction and practice. Conviction first. The Enoch narratives press us to hold two convictions simultaneously: that life is embedded in a moral order larger than our immediate circumstances, and that proximity to that order is cultivated by daily fidelity rather than dramatic gestures alone. This is a corrective to both triumphalism and despair. It resists the notion that only spectacular acts count for God, and it rebukes the fatalism that assumes justice is forever deferred. The conviction is humble. Fidelity matters, memory matters. The moral ledger is not closed. From conviction flows practice. If to walk with God is to live in habitual attentiveness, what are the concrete practices that make such walking plausible in our contemporary world? We can propose several modest, concrete habits that echo the ancient sensibility. First, habit of presence. Walking with God begins by noticing the world God entrusted to us. That might mean a daily rhythm of silence and listening, however brief, in which one names fears and hopes, and notices the small evidences of grace. It might mean an evening practice of gratitude, where we recall 3 moments of the day that showed us kindness or beauty. Second, habit of integrity in small matters. The Enoch tradition prized ongoing fidelity. In practice, that looks like honesty at work when no one is watching, returning more than expected in small debts, resisting gossip when it costs nothing to speak well of others. These are not glamorous acts, they are the scaffolding of character. Third, habit of stewardship. If Enoch's life resonates with calendar and cosmic order, we can hear an invitation to care for the rhythms of creation. Stewardship can be as simple as respecting Sabbath rhythms, tending the places where we live, or supporting sustainable practices that preserve the good of future generations. Such acts honor the sense that human life participates in a created order. Fourth, habit of memory and testimony. The Enochic scribe preserves records. We, too, can be preservers of memory. This can take practical form: writing letters to the people who shaped us, telling family stories to younger generations, keeping journals that mark moral progress and failure, and protecting historical memory in communities where erasure is a risk. Remembering is an ethical act. It resists the erasure that permits injustice to repeat. Fifth, habit of solidarity with the oppressed. Much of the Enochic imagination responds to systemic injustice. Walking with God means not only private piety, but public loyalty to the weak, the neighbor whom society forgets. This can mean voting where conscience is at stake, volunteering time with local relief organizations, or simply attending to the stories of those whose suffering is easy to ignore. Small acts of compassion, multiplied over time, become a communal ethic that witnesses to a God who keeps record of deeds. Sixth, habit of covenantal patience toward death. The Genesis note about Enoch invites us to reconsider death's meaning. We cannot promise translation or triumph over mortality, but we can cultivate a posture of eschatological trust, to live in hope that death is not the final verdict, that fidelity has its place in a larger story. Practically, that means preparing for death with the same fidelity we exercise in life, repairing relationships, arranging care, practicing forgiveness. These practices are not gimmicks. They do not guarantee spectacular outcomes. They are rather ways to orient life so that the phrase "he walked with God" could plausibly be written about us, not as a matter of bragging rights but as a quiet verdict pronounced by those who survive us, a testimony to a steady life. There is ethical urgency in this counsel. In a time where cynicism about institutions and public virtue runs high, the Enoch example resists both despair and triumphal exaggeration. It offers a middle path, faithful presence that neither withdraws from the world nor seeks to wield power in corrupt ways. It invites us to be people whose lives, at the end, are summarized not by a list of accomplishments, but by a sustained orientation toward the good. We must also acknowledge the dangers of misreading Enoch for private gain. Throughout history, the figure of Enoch has sometimes been appropriated by movements promising secret knowledge, instant transformation, or magical protection. Those appropriations betray the sober moral tenor of the Genesis line. Walking with God does not inoculate one against hardship, nor does it provide a spiritual quick fix. The biblical witness and the later Enochic expansions together teach humility about what faithfulness produces. It produces community, memory, and sometimes vindication. It does not promise immunity from trouble. As we draw together the strands of reflection, the trajectory becomes clear. A single line in Genesis, faint, enigmatic, invited centuries of imaginative conversation because it named a possibility that communities long to inhabit, that a human life could mirror divine order, that ordinary fidelity could stand before cosmic chaos, and that memory and record could anchor hope. The later Enochic literature gave shape to those longings with angels, ledgers, and visions of judgment. It served as both mirror and map for communities seeking to resist injustice and to reorder time around sacred rhythms. Its afterlife in places as diverse as the caves at Qumran and the liturgical books of the Ethiopian Church testifies to its broad spiritual appeal. What, then, is the final word for us who hear this story now? Return to the simplicity that started the whole conversation. Genesis does not give us celestial travelogue. It gives a verdict. He walked with God. That verdict invites a question we must answer in our own lives. Who are you walking with? Is your daily trajectory oriented toward love, justice, fidelity, and the careful stewardship of time? Or do you find your steps measured by other things, ambition, fear, the pressure to perform? You can begin the exercise of walking with God in small, stubborn ways. Notice the weather as if it belonged to a larger order. Speak the truth when it costs you nothing and when it costs you much. Keep the memory of those who suffered alive in your conversations. Choose the long work of repairing relationships even when resentment makes it easier to withdraw. Mark time with gratitude and Sabbath rest that resists the tyranny of endless productivity. These are modest acts, but modest acts over a lifetime compose a faithful walk. If the Enoch narratives have anything to teach us, it is that fidelity is not always visible. It is often a quiet accumulation of choices. The ancients, struggling beneath imperial weight and cultural disruption, invested imagination and theology in a man whose life could be reduced to one phrase. That was their way of saying that the enduring worth of a life is not the spectacle it makes, but the pattern it follows. So take the title seriously. Enoch, the man who walked with God. Let it be less an exotic exemplar and more a mirror. Lean toward the small disciplines of presence and integrity. Let your days, like his, be marked by a steady companionship with the divine, and trust that faithful walking is itself a kind of testimony. If this reflection has moved you, share it with someone who needs a steadying thought, and tell us in the comments how you understand walking with God. May your steps be measured not by headlines, but by constancy. May memory keep you honest, and may the small acts of your days accumulate into a life that, in some quiet way, merits the phrase, "He walked with God." peace to the journey you are on.